You talked about the people being the kind of governing our sort of society, but with no experience of war. And I was interested to see whether you thought there was a direct link between how we have our impressions of war and the media's portrayal of war, in particular through like photography in papers and as such.
That sounds as if it's to me, is it?
Yeah.
I think we have a problem, and I think we also have a problem that that since 9/11, direct war reporting, wars today are wars among the people. You can't report them among the people, or you'll probably get your head knocked off. And this is what happened to Mary Colvin in February of this year. So what's happened is the war reporters, what Ernie Pyle did, what William Howard Russell did, what George Orwell did, is no longer being done. And we live in a world of many platforms and multimedia, but we are less and less aware of the reality of war. But most of the questions have got to be to the other guys, because I'm too old. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Winston Churchill said that there's nothing more exhilarating than being shot at, provided you're not hit. And I think that goes some way to explain this ambivalent attitude among people who have experienced wars, that on the one hand, it was probably the most exciting and wonderful experience of their lives, while recognizing that war is also an absolutely horrible and obscene activity. Winston Churchill took part in the last full cavalry charge of the British Army towards the end of the 18th century. And
19th, I think.
Sorry, 19th century,
Yeah,
beg your pardon.
yeah.
And it reminded me that when I was at Staff College, we had to read a gentleman called Clausewitz, who stated that war is the continuation of foreign policy by another means. And that seems to me to have made reasonable sense in the 19th century, when it was still possible to fight a war and to actually hope that you achieved something positive at the end of it.
Yeah.
I find it impossible to think of a war that's taken place in the last 100 years where anybody emerged better than when he started. And this seems to me to be a watershed. I can't explain the reasons for it, but maybe it's partly to do with the fact that in the 19th century, wars were generally fought remotely, and the public didn't know about the result until it was all over, and they didn't hear about the casualties until the troops came back 10% fewer than when they went. Since the last century, wars have become more and more in the public domain, and people like your good self have been able to report wars as they are going along, and therefore the public are far more conscious of the horrors of war, and at the same time there have been no discernible benefits from the war, and that has resulted in the attitude present that wars are totally obscene and totally pointless.
What Churchill actually said was the exhilaration of being shot at without result. Did you enjoy being shot at, Patrick?
Yeah, I think at the risk of and at the risk of it kind of seeming like a kind of mutual writers backslapping each other, one of the breathtaking things to my mind about Ben's book was that he has captured an authentic voice of soldiers, which is Western societies have volunteer armies, and there are various motivations. And Geoff has alluded to the United States Marine Corps, which I think does have a very distinct philosophy. I don't think, certainly in my experience of the British Army, people joined because they wanted to kill people, but they joined, many of them, because they wanted to test themselves against something. We are the kind of the laziest, least tested generation of a very long time. We've done nothing to prove ourselves compared to in my case, our grandfathers. And there's a great line in Fight Club, the book and the film, where the Brad Pitt character, alter ego character, so Edward Norton in the film, says, "What can a man know about himself if he's never been in a fight?" This pampered life in front of a screen, everything on a plate generation. And I do feel lucky to have been among people who've sort of spent 7 months without electricity, without kind of food, testing yourself against something that other people have not. But of course, that is predicated on not being the guy that gets shot. And I was very lucky, and luck is all there is to it.
Any thoughts? Next question.
Oh, well,
Yes,
I
yes,
did
yes.
have
Go
a
on, Geoff.
thought. I mean, I think it's very interesting that you mentioned this cavalry charge, because I think from the First World War onwards, one of the strange things that happened is that the lot of the infantry soldier became very increasingly passive. So the dominant experience of the First World War soldier, it seems to me, so I've read, was to endure shelling. And it's that sort of strange combination where people have wanted to be tested on active duty, whereas a great deal of it is, of soldiering, is this awful passivity. And in the recent wars, this passivity has taken on some new level, and I think this is something that's come across so powerfully in all of the books. What the soldiers have found most intolerable is this thing of IEDs, whereby you go out on patrol, and I think Younger expresses this so brilliantly. He says, only the fact that the only proof that you've got of being alive is the fact that you hadn't been blown up 1 minute previously. And there's a bit in the Finkel book where he's talking about the disillusion that sets in, and he says they were tired of waiting to be blown up. They were tired of being mortared every day at the COP. They were tired of being told they were winning when they weren't. Just that awful passivity of waiting to be blown up. It seems to me that might be the defining experience of the modern soldier.
Any other? Oh, by the way, the Clausewitz of our time, since you mentioned Clausewitz, is a wonderful British general called General Sir Rupert Smith, and I'm sure his book, The Utility of Force, is here somewhere. It's been translated. It's the ultimate analysis of where we are with modern warfare. It's been translated into Arabic, Hebrew, and French. Yes, at the back.
Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you for your comments. You mentioned some of the great war reporters of previous generations, people like Pyle and Hemingway and Gellhorn, and I was wondering if any of you had any thoughts on how the nature of war correspondence has changed, and whether what makes a good war reporter today is fundamentally the same as what made a good war reporter 50 or 100 years ago.
Ben, have you got any thoughts? I've got too many thoughts. I'm not going to bore you with them.
Well, I agree with Geoff. I think an extraordinary amount of first-rate reportage has come out of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And I think maybe what separates it from the reportage in this war from previous wars, and certainly from wars, say, from 1950 previous, is, there was a kind of implicit romance going on in the reportage from World War I and World War II. Even while they were acknowledging the horror and the futility, there was still this aroma of the 19th century lingering. But I think, starting with Michael Herr's Dispatches, which I think is one of the great American books, period, fiction, nonfiction, you started to get a different tone, a much more searching and maybe existential tone. So at least, in my limited reading, I think there is a difference.
Patrick, what do you think of war reporters? You've seen us, you've been one.
Yeah, I think there's an inherent difficulty in Afghanistan at the moment, which was alluded to, because it's very, very difficult to be there unless you are supported by ISAF. And as soon as you're supported by ISAF, no matter how hard you try as an embedded reporter, you will have a different perspective to a truly independent reporter. I think there are a couple of people out there who take huge risks, who do blog very independently. Michael Yon is an American who I think writes very credibly and maintains more independence than most. But this problem of people being co-opted, and I've seen it since I left the army when I went back as a civilian, as a reporter in inverted commas, you are suddenly handled far more, and how you can report impartially when that happens is a difficult question.
It takes independence of mind, it takes steadiness under fire, and a huge amount of luck. I would never promote a book that I wrote, but in my book about the Bosnian War, there was actually an account of being the father of embedded journalism, because in the Gulf War I was actually embedded with the Queen's Royal Irish Hussars, the QRIH, also known as the queerest regiment in history. And what you're doing is you're trading freedom for access.
This thing of embeddedness, I think, is very important, and certainly for photographers, part of the attraction of the Libyan conflict was that it was a sort of return to the Vietnam era, where you could just run around in this kind of cavalier buccaneering style. But of course, as the cameraman who was with Sebastian Junger in Afghanistan, Tim Hetherington, paid the price for that. Just two things about these embedded, all the books coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan, they tend to be the product of embeddedness. Two things. One is whatever the sort of political views these reporters have of the war, they all end up being unanimous in their admiration for the incredible things that the soldiers are able to do. And then secondly, in the acknowledgements, what's striking to me is, I think because of the inevitable delay in the publication of the book, they all pay tribute to the army for being incredibly uncensoring and incredibly tolerant of criticism. That's the benefit of the delay in publication, as opposed to if you're a news journalist having to publish stuff every week or every day.
And Tim Hetherington, of course, did the ultimate war movie on Afghanistan, Restrepo.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd be interested.
Microphone.
I'd be interested in everybody's perspective on the relationship between the military and government. Martin alluded to the fact of now governments who have never experienced war sending people out to war. On the other hand, we wouldn't want a pet soldier in the cabinet. So what would we ideally like to see from the perspective of the army, reporters?
Well, first of all, I want to see independent-minded MPs who are not going to be conned and voting to a war which is fought on the basis of a falsehood. That's for a start. And I would like ministers who listen to the chiefs of staff, and then we can go somewhere. The dangerous ones are the messianic ones who have faith in themselves, and we should have learned enough lessons these last years. But that's enough from me. You've got thoughts, Ben?
Yeah, talking about messianic leaders, I mean, yes. Oh, you've heard this story. About George Bush telling a group of ministers who came to the governor's mansion in Texas, he said, well, God, wants me to run for president. I think I have a mission. And I mean, that's the most, and then, I mean, on top of that, this is a man who actively avoided combat in Vietnam, along with virtually everybody else in his cabinet and in his inner circle. I mean, there's a hypocrisy going on here it goes beyond hypocrisy, and it becomes a kind of madness or schizophrenia. And I mean, I think in the United States, the military was completely hijacked by that particular government, with disastrous results.
Any thoughts? You've met messianic leaders in your front line?
Yeah, no, I mean, I can't remember who it was. My instinct says it was Clemenceau who said that war's too important to be left to generals. And we've somehow come in this complete circle where instead of politicians restraining generals, generals restrain politicians. And I think I'm right in saying that the individual who pushed hardest and in fact insisted on Lord Goldsmith's legal justification for the invasion of Iraq was the First Sea Lord. So you've got these politicians with no experience in the military champing at the bit, and you've got generals and admirals exercising caution. That's a strange place to arrive at. But I would not. I don't necessarily think that means we should be packing our executive and legislature with soldiers, because you can go far too far in the opposite direction, and you don't have to have been a doctor to run the health service. You don't have to have been a soldier to be in the Ministry of Defence. I think there needs to be a balance. Perhaps.
Wouldn't you make rather a good MP?
No.
Yes.
I wonder if the panel have a view on whether democracy is actually limiting the way that the Allied troops are fighting their war because of the immediacy of the reporting and the impact it has on public opinion, which obviously leads then to changes in governments of those participating countries.
Yeah?
No, I have no thoughts.
Well, I've got lots of opinions, but it's called the CNN effect. I see nothing wrong in that we are all aware of what's going on in that disordered world beyond our borders to an extent that we never were before, if we can take our eyes off Big Brother. And then we put pressure on our leaders to be aware of it themselves and to do something about it. If we had not taken any action in Bosnia, and we took it 3 years too late, even more people would have died than the 98,000 who did. And according to my UN friends there, 100,000 people were saved by the UN intervention who would not have been saved otherwise. I had a huge argument about this with Douglas Hurd in 1995 and 1996. And he called me a founder member of the Something Must Be Done Club. I think we're much better where we are in a democracy, that we, the voters, and the general public know what's being done in our name. Any thoughts?
Well, I'd sign me up to the Something Must Be Done Club. I mean, one of the books that influenced me when I was starting to join the army was General Romeo Dallaire's Shake Hands with the Devil. Romeo Dallaire was the Canadian general in Rwanda at the time of the genocide there. And that's what happens when we don't do anything, when there's no political will, when we can't really be bothered. Liberal interventionists, to give a label, are a kind of dying and endangered species at the moment, because the cry is there is no money and we never succeed and it's too messy and it's too difficult. But I think in the society that we all live in, by dint of being sat here in Waterstones on Piccadilly, which is indescribably rich and privileged compared to some of the countries I've served in, perhaps we owe it back to the wider society to try and do what we can.
In fact, one of the books I'm not promoting, I lay out the tests that had to be met before we use armed intervention by force. And we're facing this problem with Syria, we face in Libya. First, it's got to be legal under the United Nations, the Charter or an authorizing resolution. Second, it's got to be proportionate, and lobbing weapons of shock and awe into a marketplace near Baghdad does not come in that category. Third, it's got to be democratically supported. There's no soldier, there's no lonelier soul on earth than a soldier in an unsupported war. And lastly, it's got to be doable. The doability is the problem in Afghanistan. Yeah. One more, says the boss. Yes. Come to the microphone at the front, please.
Hi. I'm wondering what you guys think of the future of military conflict, because I feel like the 20th century is very much like nation states going at war against each other. And I don't know, I think that militaries are studying, how to deal with environmental catastrophes and mass migrations of populations and the kind of fallout of globalization. And I wonder if, what your thoughts are on, how wars will be fought in the future, whether it'll, how to contain populations or the,
Patrick, are there any officers?
Well, Martin's already alluded to General Rupert Smith's Utility of Force, which I think envisages a future in which those discrete battlefields where you're in uniform and I'm in uniform and we're against each other, they are a thing of the past. And all future conflict, be it full-scale war, be it counterinsurgency, be it low-level conflict management, will be among the people. And I think that's the challenge, is for militaries to diversify their skill base and to be sufficiently adaptable so that they can do that. And actually, and obviously I would say this, but we have come in for sustained criticism, but when you look at the challenges that various Western armies have faced in what they've done in the last 20 years, I think they've actually acquitted themselves in a number of circumstances quite well, given that the challenges they were facing were not what they trained for, not necessarily what they envisaged, and not what they were designed for.
Future war, Ben?
I really don't know enough about it to comment.
It hasn't happened yet, obviously.
Sorry, I'm saying
all I can say is, and I've been an awful lot, we can't afford a future like our past. The world is changing very fast. Civilians are at the heart of all wars now. The civilianization of casualties is something that is observable in my experience. I think in the Great War, as far as we know, the ratio of military casualties to civilian was 90-1. What have we done to 10? What have we done in the nearly 100 years since we've managed to turn it around? But anyway, you've got some fantastic authors here, and they're all going to sign their books, and thank you very much.